Welcome to you all to Behind the Music. My name is Andrew Chung. I'm artistic producer of London Sinfonia, and I'm welcoming today our guest conductor, Matthias Maute. Hello, Matthias.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me.
And also welcoming our esteemed concertmaster, Joe Lanza. How are you, Joe?
I'm just fine, Andrew. Hi, Matthias.
Hello. Hi, Joe.
Great. So this Behind the Music episode is talking about our upcoming concert, and this is Under a Summer Sky being performed on February 4th, live from Metropolitan United. So the last time, Matthias, that you joined us at London Sinfonia was just before March 2020. And we all know what happened then. So that particular program was Mozart and Haydn, and I think that we've brought a little chunk of that program forward to this particular concert. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the concert was so much fun, and for me, so great to get to know the orchestra and the particular way it's performing. So, realizing that I think the London Sinfonia really stands out in the Canadian symphony landscape for its approach, because it includes historically informed performance practice into classical music like Mozart and Haydn, like we did last time, which in itself is really interesting and really rare among symphonies. And so it was quite natural to sort of take that thread and putting some of that into our program that we are doing very soon. So one quartet by Mozart will be in an arranged version for a string orchestra, will be performed as program opener at our concert Under the Summer Sky.
That's great. And I think that one movement in particular was performed in that Mozart and Haydn program back in 2020. Is that right, Joe?
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, a sort of mysterious opening slow movement that fit what we were talking about with Mozart and Haydn's friendship at the time.
And we expect people to recall this moment.
Note for note, right?
Note for note.
Just like Mozart could. And so this is music by teenage Mozart. What is it about this piece that lends itself to a string orchestra interpretation?
Well, first of all, it's a collection that he wrote in 2 months. So he was like young, enthusiastic, passionate, and just put one quartet after the other on paper. So it seemed to us that the bigger scope of a string orchestra lends like an aura of a bigger scope to the piece, which is in itself it's very interesting. And it turns out that Mozart in this particular quartet incorporates contrapuntal techniques that are advanced for classical music on that level for a composer at that age. And on 2 different levels, you find it in a highly turbulent last movement, which is really sort of crazy, and that beautiful second movement that in some ways the motif is taken directly from Baroque language, but it goes into almost like at moments some kind of romantic touch, looking into the years and decades to come. So it has really interesting features that Joe and I thought would be really interesting to make something big in orchestra sound, just like, by the way, Tchaikovsky for a Serenade, who advocates you should put as many string players as possible. It makes the piece better, so to speak. So that is our idea for the Mozart quartet. You put more players, it will be an even better piece.
and by this time, I think Mozart had composed all of his violin concerti, and he's already showing signs of this mature genius, right, Joe?
It's around that same time. And yes, I think it is the beginning of his mature genius. Even such a young guy, 17 years old, so precocious that I don't know, the vision that so few of us have as artists was already apparent in a mature but young way. There was much more to come. And that's an interesting parallel with Tchaikovsky, because Tchaikovsky started very young as well and was a bit of a child prodigy.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, while preparing the program, I couldn't help myself think about what have I been doing when I was 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something we can share publicly, Matthias? I don't know, but we can
What I've
bypass that. We can bypass that. So it's such a remarkably concise, it's a perfect work. And Matthias, we're adding a little twist to it, and we're inserting 3 of your preludes in between the movements. Tell us about that.
I like to see myself as a performer, to be sort of communicating with the composer. Obviously, the composer in classical music, usually they are dead, but music seems to be one way to communicate and to connect with people in the audience, with performers on stage, and to some degree with people who have been living back then, because we still understand the aesthetic, we believe to understand what they try to communicate. So for me, the idea is already like in the concert setting is a dialogue on different levels. And I like to push it a step further. In this case, I was very happy that we could sort of include that dialogue into the structure of the piece, because in between the movements by Mozart, there are 3 short preludes that I composed myself, and that will be premiered in that particular setting with the London Sinfonia in February. So it's very exciting for myself to see that there's sort of a back and forth. And the idea is not to sort of prove that a composer these days can compose like Mozart or on the same level or anything like that. That's not the point. The point is that these little preludes give a little taste of what do we think these days about music? What do you think in between the movements by Mozart? What kind of thought could emerge? And I thought it's just interesting to involve ourselves and get ourselves as part of a performance. As we do it, we put our soul online, so to speak, when we perform, but to do it also in a creative way by inserting our own musical thoughts. And of course, the language is quite different, but a couple of elements are referring to Mozart, like the counterpoint. There's a strict counterpoint between the solo violin and the viola section in 2 of the preludes, and there's a little waltz that sort of goes a step, like historically speaking, a step further than the minuet that was typical in Mozart's time in Vienna. And we, of course, everyone knows the waltz from Vienna and so on. So it's just neat to get the chance to exchange ideas. It's a bit like having a beer with a composer after a performance and talking about music.
I love that idea. It's like talking with the composer, but talking about the music of the composer with music, not with words so much, right?
Exactly.
And it's not that uncommon from something that would have happened in the time. They were all riffing off each other and what they heard from each other, and giving nods to each other's work, and Mozart to Haydn and Haydn to Mozart. Very, very cool. So I'm looking forward to to hearing and playing these preludes. The 3rd prelude is an excerpt from a concerto that you wrote. Is that right?
Yeah, I wrote a violin concerto a couple of years ago, and in slow movement, which deals with the story of the slow movement is an excerpt of the slow movement that has also incorporated the idea of the dialogue between the solo violin and the viola. However, in this case, reinforced by the fact that in a violin concerto, it's all about Orpheus and Eurydice, and they never meet each other. So coming back from the underworld, they just never get to meet. And the canon, when the 2 parts are exactly the same, but they never line up, seems to express perfectly the idea of getting lost on the way back. And then, of course, catastrophe ensues. So in the concerto, it goes a bit further, but indeed that part of when they never meet and never get together, to some degree, could also express that dichotomy of when Mozart has lived centuries ago, we live today, and we will never get together. At the same time, by virtue of performing his music, there's still something in the air. And so I thought that would be the perfect expression of what we try to do for this concert.
I love that idea, because we have Tchaikovsky, who so loved and admired Mozart's music, but their paths never crossed. And then we have Freiner, who is a friend of ours among us, teaches at Western with me. I run into him all the time. So I find, I've a little bit of a spoiler. I've been looking closely at Matthias's preludes because they have solo violin parts in part, and they're very beautiful and they're very reflective. And somehow they speak to, as Matthias has been saying, to the spanning of the time, forward and backward, and the question of what would Mozart have meant to Tchaikovsky? What do Mozart and Tchaikovsky mean to Freiner? And what would those guys later than Mozart have meant to Mozart if he could have met them? Right? These are all, so, and we bring them together through their music, and I love those reflective moments about what's to come in this program. It's later music and how is it related? How is it not related? What does it mean to us?
Thanks very much for encouraging words, Joe. You just elevated me 2 inches above the ground.
Now, the Mozart and Tchaikovsky, they always pair well together. That's, different music, different eras. So, but why is that? I mean, Mozart was Tchaikovsky was a big admirer of Mozart. He wrote a piece, Mozartiana, right? But why do we think that they work so well together?
Transparency, I think. The music has a clarity and a transparency. It also has for me, a very immediate effect. We don't always think of Mozart this way, but I do. Tchaikovsky's music is clearly extremely expressive and lyrical. But when I think of Mozart's music, I always think of opera and singing. And so that very powerful expressiveness, that heightened expression that one gets through sung music, I think it exists in all of Mozart's music. I hear singing, and maybe a better way to put it is I hear a kind of heightened expression in everything that Mozart does. And to me, that's the link.
Mm-hmm. Also, and of course, this is sort of, an assumption. It will be difficult to verify, but it seems to me that ideas came always quite easily to Mozart, and Tchaikovsky, I think, has the same kind of, just he had great ideas. And just like Dvorak was known for, you bring it up. He just had ideas, and it never stopped. As opposed to other composers like Corelli, who had to think about months to get one sonata done, and just with a way smaller output. And I think on that level, Tchaikovsky and Mozart, they are so popular because they caught ideas out of the air that were sort of easily accessible, and were still complex enough to make great music out of it. And on that level, I think the two geniuses from two different centuries meet, and both, by the way, I think from our perspective, sometimes suffer from that judgment that both Tchaikovsky and Mozart are sort of maybe a little superficial in their way of composing. And I don't think at all this is true. It's just because their motifs are so popular, and it has probably to do with the fact that it came quite easily to them. And then it's quite astounding when you look at the serenade and the last movement, which is clearly intended to be an imitation by Mozart, but it's sort of a bit naive. It's great music, very jolly and highly energetic. But to think that Mozart might have composed this way, I mean, no one would come up with that idea these days. It's a bit like Kreisler, Fritz Kreisler, violinist, when he writes Vivaldi concertos. Doesn't sound like Vivaldi, but in his mind and for his contemporaries, that's what it was. And as a result, there was beautiful music created. And it's the same for Tchaikovsky. So it's one thing that the sort of the mind game we play with ourselves, that we try to connect and come back with our own time and try to emulate a certain style. But ultimately, the result is always something that reflects ourselves more than the source of the inspiration might indicate.
Yeah, that last movement of that Mozart, it just always strikes me that a 17-year-old guy could write a piece that's essentially counterpoint, and it's so full of joy and brilliance. Like, to combine those two things, it's with the skill that he did and with the effect that he does. That's one of the signs that you see in this piece, that a 17-year-old could do that. As Matthias said, nobody else was doing that then. Nobody else thought to do that. He was breaking ground in a way. He hadn't settled on his final style yet, but you could see that he was really heading for great things, and that he was producing remarkable music already.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, when I think of Tchaikovsky's string music, and so he's got the 3-string quartets. There's the Souvenir de Florence. There's the Serenade, the
Violin concerto,
massive violin concerto, beloved, the cello concerto. So, is there I think of Tchaikovsky as a very lush sound, but is there a period style way to approach this? Is that what we will endeavor for? Any hints, Matthias?
Well, there's one really very interesting fact, and it's Leopold Auer. He was teaching in Petersburg at the conservatory, not in Moscow, but Petersburg, and he was sort of the violin teacher in Russia at that time. His students famously were like Jascha Heifetz was one of his most well-known students. And he was very outspoken about the use of vibrato. And when you read that, it just blows your mind. How is it possible that someone in the 19th century can be so adverse to massive use of vibrato, actually to vibrato at all? And I think he considered it as one of his big failures in his life, that like his most famous students all went onto a totally different road. Like Jascha Heifetz, he established the permanent vibrato on the soloistic level. But I think it's quite obvious that one could make the claim that the general fact that vibrato as orchestra culture, not as solo player, but as orchestra culture, was not really an issue until 1920, 1930, can still be fully applied to Tchaikovsky's Serenade. Now, what that means, I'm very curious what kind of inroads we can do on that level, because I think there's no reason to throw our own comfort zone totally out into the cold water. But based on my experience with the London Sinfonia the other time with Haydn and Mozart, the orchestra is so flexible and so wonderfully flexible from the mindset and from the capacity to actually realize that it will be interesting to try things on that level, because I think it will change the sound of the piece tremendously. It's a wonderful piece. I mean, it's not for nothing that like the waltz is so well known, has been used for movies, and because like Mozart, it can go onto all different. It can go down more the sentimental road. It can also have like a very more complex approach and so on. But it's music that is very appealing and understandable on the spot. And so my hope will be that no matter or regardless what we do with the piece, that the audience, when we play the waltz, will get up and dance while we play.
I agree, and I'm excited that Matthias is going to be doing this. I'm very open to re-exploring this music again. I've played it a lot, and you know, of course, when you play a beautiful passage, you want to play it beautifully. But the thing about so much music is it's more than pretty or even beautiful. It expresses a range of emotions, which can be powerful or subtle or complex. And I think bringing an openness to the idea of how to best bring that alive, as opposed to just making it pretty or attractive or the style du jour, that interests me, because when the music comes more alive, I think it's more satisfying for us as performers, but I think it leads to a more powerful experience for the audience. So that remains a goal and a possibility for us. And having someone like Matthias, I feel that there's more potential that we might reach for that kind of goal.
I love that too. And it's nice that we're not just applying the same sauce to every single note, the same vibrato. We could try something a little bit different in our rehearsals. Well, can't wait to work on this program with you both. Thank you so much for joining me, Joe, and thank you, Matthias.
Yes.
I'm looking forward very much.
And now we welcome composer Paul Frehner. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Andrew. How you doing?
Hopefully I've got this right. You're assistant professor of composition over at Western University. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I'm associate professor of composition over at Western. Yeah, that's right. That's it.
Okay, so Paul, we've been at London Symphony, been wanting to play a piece of yours for many years now, and finally we get the opportunity with this.
Yeah, I'm thrilled it's happening.
I know, me too.
Great.
So, Mojave Dreaming, commissioned for Sound Stream's 2014-15 season. When did they approach you to compose something?
Yeah, it was probably around maybe 8 or 9 months before that. I think it was around this maybe September, October of 2013.
Right.
Yeah.
And that to me doesn't seem like a whole lot of time for something that's so intense, and you had to go to the desert, or maybe you didn't go to the desert.
It didn't go. That's the dreaming part.
That was the dreaming part. I love it.
Yeah.
And so they asked for something that was seasonal, right? Was it do sound streams, do they program in a way where they do a blend of old music and new Canadian music, or is it more new music focused?
It's like both of those. It depends on really the project and what the concept is for the event. And so one thing they seem to do is really pair Canadian composers with fantastic professional ensembles, maybe from Canada, but maybe elsewhere as well. And so, I've done quite a few projects with them, and so for Mojave Dreaming, we were paired with a Toronto-based string orchestra.
Okay.
But also on that program was Mac Richter's reinterpretation of the seasons, and violinist Daniel Hope, who I believe is British. I think he came and he performed on that. He performed the solo part for Richter's reinterpretation of the seasons for that concert, and so. And other projects that I've done with them, they've sort of paired me with other artists, Canadian or international as well. And so it's an interesting model that they have.
Very interesting. Daniel Hope, he's a crackerjack of a player. He's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And so it's just a string piece, and then you've got one keyboardist playing like a harpsichord and then sampled sounds. So was that your choice, or was that the ensemble that you were presented with to work to compose for?
So a bit of both again. So they were doing the reinterpretation of the seasons, and Lawrence Cherney, who's the artistic director of Soundstreams, he was wanting a piece that was somehow related to the concept of the seasons for the evening, and so they had a string orchestra in place. And I'm trying to remember the Richter piece, if he had harpsichord or not in that, but. I spent a bit of time listening to Vivaldi, and the idea of the continuo was very interesting for me. And I thought of, well, let's have a bit of the old in the continuo, and let's use harpsichord, but then let's bring that idea of the continuo into the 21st century, and let's add sampler to it as well.
It's so effective. Gives you a great range of color, right, to work with, and possibility. And now we'll get to the story within the piece in just a minute. There's three movements to it, and there's a big storm, right? The haboob. Yep. And these dust devils. Did you have to work hard to develop the musical language to depict the desert, the storms, that dry heat? Or is this something that was already in your in your musical language?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because like the musical language is something that I focus on quite a bit in what I do, and I've sort of got, certain, if you want to call them tools or something, a little toolbox that I bring along with me from piece to piece. And some tools are like go-to things, but other times I find, for this sort of idea, I need to maybe develop something and maybe find a way of integrating it into my existing tool set, which is sort of related to like the musical language. So for this piece, it was there were some new things that were incorporated, or that I had just begun incorporating around the same time, maybe in some other pieces that sort of led to this piece. And whereas some other elements were related to things that I've been doing for a while.
Well, let's walk through the piece, and then maybe you can tell me if there was a new or had it in the toolkit already. It's three movements. It starts with a movement called Heat Haze. And what I love about your piece is that you give the performers these descriptions, just like Vivaldi did. He gave these poetic descriptions, helping the performer understand and imagine what's in your imagination, right? So you've written here, the heated air causes objects in the distance to shimmer and blur. And you wrote, the sun gradually reaches its zenith, illuminating a parched landscape. And then I think you use some really neat effects here. Do you want to tell me about a couple of them in this heat haze movement?
Yeah. So the notion for this movement was sort of inspired by that phenomenon. If you're like, say, in a car on a hot day and you see the road, and then you see the road itself start to blur, and it looks watery almost. Like we can see it here in London or in Canada. Just on a hot day, you'll see this sort of thing. But I can imagine in the desert you'll see a lot more of it, and it might be pretty intense. And so the piece starts with some rumbling, some like very low frequency noise, which could just be like the noise of the road or something, and then some higher pitched sounds come in from the sampler, and then the strings come in. And I was trying to find a musical way of doing a parallel between the visual effect of, like, there's a road there and you can see things in the distance clearly, you can see things close clearly, but then the middle's blurred.
Right.
There's that little blurry spot where the haze is.
Yes.
And so basically I've got these like intervals played in the strings, of course, and then we've got difference tones. We have added tones above and difference tones below. Right. So it creates a bit of a spectral type of impression. So I was sort of relating it to this sort of spectralism. So you could think that the heat haze is a bit of a distortion in the visual spectrum. Right. And like the wavelengths that we see. And I thought, well, let's try and find a way to create that similar sort of distortion in the audible spectrum.
And in that movement, in the score, in the string writing, you asked for microtonal, adjustments as the instruments kind of nudge up or they head down. And it's kind of creates this smear and this haze. It's a wonderful, wonderful effect. Different than a glissando where it's just completely seamless. You actually write out the microtonal where we should be, as the conductor keeps going. And you're also very specific about the vibrato too, which is interesting. A little bit wider or wilder vibrato, and then simmering it down.
Yeah, as if the haze is getting a bit more intense. It's a bit more it's distorting our vision a bit more.
Totally. And then the haboob starts, which is this big. Is it a massive sandstorm? Is that
massive sandstorm? It's the term for a massive sandstorm, and I think they might in the United States, in some places, they might actually use that term for it, and possibly in the Middle East they use that term as well.
Yeah, and in the score you've written serpents, lizards, critters bask in the heat of the sun. So it starts in a calm way. I hear the harpsichord and pizzicato kind of plicky plonk, and then in the middle this solo violinist kind of goes off with these 16th notes. What does that represent?
What does it represent? I guess that's like the human experience, right? The soloist, because the rest of the ensemble is quite sort of descriptive of the the natural phenomena, right? Of this storm that's eventually coming, and it starts very slowly, that storm, before it gets quite intense. But then the idea of giving it some aspect of the human experience. So it's like the human inside the storm. So in this case, a bit of a soloist, an individual is inside the storm. And there's a lot of Vivaldi type of arpeggio playing in that solo part. And I guess a bit of a nod to the fact that inspired by and being paired with the seasons on this concert.
Very cool. And then you've written other things like the wind begins to blow, the wind picks up dust in greater and greater quantities. The dust forms into a cloud, and then eventually the haboob moves on. I mean, a lot happens in this movement. It's got a wonderful arc to it. And it's intense. It's very, very evocative. Like, I mean, you could easily imagine this underscoring a very intense film.
Right. Yeah. Quite possibly. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. But then it's not done. You just go on and move on and feature a new protagonist, antagonist. The
Dust Devils.
Movement number 3, the Dust Devils. I hear these menacing jabs, by the bass and the cello, alternating with these extremely fast 16ths in the upper strings. It's just got tons of personality. How did you land on the Dust Devils to feature so prominently?
Well, as far as, say, there being 3 movements, I thought I'd like to reflect that aspect of the Vivaldi individual concertos. They're all 3 movement concertos. So I was, again, the dreaming aspect, like imagining, what it might be to experience the phenomena of being in the desert. And I guess like these sort of visual things were quite compelling, but more interesting than like being thirsty, And just like, I need some water, some water.
That would be great.
I guess the title could have been, "Is there a lake somewhere?" I need an oasis. But no, so these Dust Devils, I saw some videos of them and images of them, and this idea that it all starts from the ground. Is the ground up, right? And so like the wind, I guess the wind comes from above, but then it stimulates the loose sand on the ground and creates a little bit of a vortex, and then the Dust Devils rise from the ground and they go pretty high, and then they just dissipate, or maybe they race around as well. And so that's why in the movement, almost everything sort of starts from the basses and cellos and moves up into the strings.
And then it's cooled by that surrounding air, and the Dust Devils quickly dissipate. You actually write that in the score, and with that, it comes to the end of the piece.
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome. So while composing this, while doing your research, you become a desert meteorologist expert on all sorts of weather phenomena. It's an amazing piece, Paul. Thank you.
Great.
We're really excited to be rehearsing this week, and look forward to an awesome performance. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm totally looking forward to this. Can't wait to work with the orchestra and conductor and the students who are participating.
Oh yes, we've got our Western Fellows joining.
Yeah, the Western Fellows too. So this is gonna be fantastic.
It will. Thanks again, Paul.
Oh, it's a pleasure.